You probably assume that everyone thinks of time the same way you do, as a continuous linear progression. But this is because you grew up in a modern society. Time in the ancient world was thought of differently. Despite the way we modern people think of time, the people of the ancient world didn't think of time as an abstract dimension of the universe. Instead, in many ancient texts, including the Hebrew Bible, we see no indication the writers had a concept of time as an abstract dimension. Instead, reality was thought of in terms of many different processes. Some were complete, some were still unfolding, and some had not yet come to pass. Beyond this, there was no measurable abstract dimension of time. For the ancient mind, these processes were all that existed, and some scholars have noted the Hebrew Bible didn't even have a word that properly translates to our modern concept of time. We define time as the measured or measurable period during which an action, process, or condition exists or continues. We think of time as a linear progression, slowly moving us into the future. Our society is very much dependent on this concept of time. We coordinate our activities with how much time we think we have. We schedule meetings or events on certain days and at certain hours, and set minimum and maximum durations for our events. For us, time is a limited resource. There's only so much in a day. In the ancient world, in many non-Western cultures, time is understood differently. Processes, or events, are primary, and they're allowed to begin and unfold more naturally. There isn't necessarily set times for things to begin or end, nor are they measured and set by increments of time. For us, procrastination is a vice. We have tasks to complete in time. But for many non-Westerners, procrastination can be a virtue. They often let things unfold naturally and happen when they're meant to, without rushing them to occur as quickly as possible. E. Randolph Richards explains the way non-Westerners in Indonesia thought of time through his experience as a missionary there. Instead of being told church would start at a specific time, he was told it would start when Siang began. Richards tried to figure out what specific time this was, but couldn't, because some people would show up for church at around 10:30, but others didn't arrive until 11:30. Eventually, he learned that Siang did not refer to time, but was connected to temperature. Siang started when it began to get hot, typically around 10:30, and would end in the late afternoon when it began to cool down. The Indonesians were not concerned about arriving at a specific time, but when it naturally felt best for the process of church to begin. Church never started at the same time by modern Western standards, but it never started late. It began when the people arrived, and would always end at the correct time, which would be when the service finished. The process of the church service is more important than time itself. It doesn't have to end at an exact time. As Dwayne Elmer said, each event is as long or as short as it needs to be. One cannot determine the required time in advance. Time is elastic, dictated only by the natural unfolding of the event. The quality of the event is the primary issue, not the quantity of minutes or hours. Additionally, this seems to be the case with most primitive cultures. Sacha Stern says, ethnographers have found that in many, if not all, primitive or non-modern societies, the concept of time as an entity in itself simply does not exist. Reality is explained in terms of events, changes, and processes. But in these worldviews, the notion of pure time or an overarching time dimension is completely absent and unknown. The concepts of time saving and time management are similarly alien and unknown. The anthropologist Sir Edward Evans Pritchard noted the newer people lacked a word for time. The Tiv, Bantu, and Hoskins also lacked a word for time. Christopher Hallpike said that words which have been translated as time are better understood as event, occasion, or period. If these cultures felt the need to express a notion of abstract time, apart from processes, they could have invented a word, but seemed to lack the need for a concept. Evan Pritchard noted the newer don't think that time moves along through measurable increments like minutes. Instead, they think of it in terms of processes or sequences of human activities and events. This is not to say they don't understand the changes from night to day and can plan accordingly, nor do they not understand changing seasons. but they lacked a rigorous understanding of it. Winter does not begin on December 21st, but when it feels like the season has changed. For them, the flow of time happens according to the processes they experience. Things happen as they unfold, and the people respond accordingly. Events or activities are not late or early, they simply occur. Evans Pritchard said, "I do not think that they ever experience the same feeling of fighting against time or having to coordinate activities with an abstract passage of time, because their points of reference are mainly the activities themselves. Events follow a logical order, but they are not controlled by an abstract system, there being no autonomous points of reference to which activities have to conform with precision." Time in other cultures is not primarily measured by set increments, but events and activities. In our culture, time is more fundamental than processes, but in non-Western cultures, processes are what is more fundamental. And this seems to be the case for the ancient world as well. History was understood as a series of events and processes. The ancient Mesopotamians could divide time up into increments of years, months, or days, but they were secondary to the events that govern time. Jean-Jacques Glasner says, "In short, the study of the past fell under the rubric of analogy, history being a cyclical process, hence made up of recurrent events and peopled with avatars." But if you notice, Glasner says something that is interesting. Time was not understood as a linear progression, but cyclical. Time was understood to be similar to the changing seasons that cycle through. For the Mesopotamians, their lives and events were simply a reflection of the political and social conditions of the present time. Just like the seasons cycle through, so does history. Time was repeating cycles that could generate new content, but still were reflections of events that already happened in the past. John Walton says, "The passage of time was significant, but precision about the passage of time, particularly when the period transcended the life of the particular king and perhaps his predecessor, is not important. Continuity from the past, in a succession of days and months, seasons and years, extended under the auspices of the present reign of the king, and eventually in the light of his memory and legacy in the future, was of ultimate value. Whereas continuity is embodied in the area of endurance, level of discontinuity is reflected in the cyclical concept of reoccurrence. Whether it is the seasons, generations of families, the prominence of cities, the reigns of kings and dynasties, or the rule of empires that come and go. The arrival of one means the end of another, and thus discontinuity prevails even as patterns continue." Like the changing seasons, everything was thought of to repeat with variation. Linear progress towards the future was not how the ancient world thought of time. Because of this, they often looked to the past more than the future. Gonzalo Rubio notes the Akkadian word for future derived from the same root of the noun meaning behind or back. The future is that which is behind. The noun for past comes from the word for front. The past is in front of them, but the future is behind them. And even our English words before and after share a similar origin. The word before comes from the Germanic word for front, and the word after is a cognate of the Gothic aftra, meaning behind or back. Despite this, we modernists tend to think the opposite. The future is before us and the past is behind us. For the ancient world, the opposite was true. The past was before them and helped them to understand the present within their cyclical understanding of time. Thus, they constantly looked to the past to better understand the present. The past was idealized and looked to for guidance. Time moved them away from the ideal past, where there were greater kings and dynasties. Now, when it comes to the Hebrews, we can't find notions of cyclical time, where history was thought to repeat. But they also seem to have had a sense of progress through time. Richard Hess notes the genealogies of Genesis are different from the king lists of Mesopotamia. The king list pointed backwards to an ideal time, but the genealogies of Genesis seem to be pointing towards the future. There is progress as we move through time towards important events that God has planned, like the calling of Abraham, the founding of the nation of Israel, or the kingship of David. The Hebrews saw history repeating itself, but also in the sense there was progress through the cycles of history. Second Temple Jews would have seen history as moving us towards the coming of the Messiah and God establishing his kingdom on earth. But what pushed Israel in this direction was not increments of time, but key events God ordered history with. The events of Israel's past were what caused progression, not an abstract dimension of time. Thus, God could never be late in causing the next event to happen, as the events themselves were what caused time to move forward. Apart from this process, there is no concept of an abstract dimension of time that flowed apart from the events that God orchestrated. The scholar Sacha Stern goes so far as to say, Jewish works in Hebrew and Aramaic remain devoid of the concept of time throughout the period of earlier and late antiquity. In antiquity, the worldview of Hebrew and Aramaic-speaking Jews remains completely process-related. Reality was seen as a succession of objects and events, whereas the notions of time as an entity itself, a human resource, continuous flow, or a structure or dimension of the created world were simply non-existent. Stern notes there's no word for time in a general sense. Terms in the Bible used for aspects of time more likely refer to appointed periods, or periods of time, but not a continuum of time as a whole. If we take a look at the word Olam, which is commonly translated as forever or eternity, we can see it doesn't really mean that. Often we translate the stipulations of the Mosaic Covenant as being spoken of as existing forever. But Stern notes the word is not a temporal word, meaning something is in effect forever. It instead carries the non-temporal meaning of stability or permanence. Thus it more refers to something being permanent and an unbreakable aspect of the Mosaic Covenant. For example, Exodus 21 says, if a slave is willing, his master will pierce his ear, and he shall be a slave Olam, meaning he will be a permanent slave for the duration of his life, not a slave literally forever. Likewise, the commands of the Mosaic Covenant were permanently in effect until the Mosaic Covenant was broken, which Jeremiah spoke of. The word Olam doesn't necessarily mean the stipulations of the Mosaic Covenant, like keeping the Sabbath, were meant to last for all time. As Harold Dressler noted, the Sabbath is not viewed as a universal ordinance for all mankind, but as a specific institution for Israel. As a sign of the covenant, it was to last as long as that covenant. Some might try to argue we see abstract time in the Hebrew Bible, since it speaks of time increments like days or years. But this is reading our modern understanding of time increments onto an ancient text. Stern says, years, months, weeks, and days are not really units of pure time, but only calendrical categories that represent the duration or length of either astronomical or seasonal processes, or socially sanctioned cycles of human activity. The divisions they used were helpful for following the flow of a process or event. Hours, for example, were less abstract and simply used to divide the daytime. In Egypt, the day was divided into 12 hours, but the hours were not exact time increments. In the summer, the 12 hours were longer, and in the winter they were shorter to match the length of daytime. Thus, hours were a way to divide up daytime, not increments of an abstract time dimension apart from daylight. Because this is how increments were often used, concepts like years and days could be used in other ways rather than providing chronological information. Years in the Hebrew Bible could be counted to establish the length of a contract, but are often symbolic rather than the actual age of something. One would assign someone an age based on the processes or events they had gone through, signifying the experience and honor they obtained. Large ages were assigned to the ancestors to signify their greatness in honor, experience, or knowledge of God. A statement of one's age, e.g. 70, does not necessarily represent the actual number of years lived, but rather the extent to which one has aged, in terms of physical appearance, as well as in terms of social standing. This is because age is not the experience of the passage of time, but rather of a process. Processes in lives were not measured by abstract time. Ages were more likely understood to represent the processes an ancestor had experienced, rather than giving us their exact lifespan. Ancient authors often use years not for chronology, but for symbolic purposes, and to reach exact values for theological messaging. Demetrius fabricated ages in order to fit a predetermined value. Eupolemus utilized patterns of 480 years to coincide with the Maccabean liberation of Jerusalem. The Book of Jubilees condensed, ignored, and changed biblical chronologies to make Israel's history fit into a series of jubilees of years. And even the Gospel of Matthew modifies the number of generations from Abraham to Jesus to get 3 perfect sets of 14. Years could be used for chronological purposes, like recording the lengths of the king's reigns in the books of Kings and Chronicles, but often they were used for symbolic purposes. When we encounter an exact or round number in the biblical text, It's more likely a symbolic number. For example, 1 Kings 6 says the Exodus happened 480 years before Solomon built the temple. But often in the ancient world, temple dedication inscriptions contained ideal numbers, instead of using numbers for chronology. The fact that 1 Kings 6 is a temple dedication text indicates it's likely a symbolic number, rather than providing accurate chronology. Kenneth Kitchen says, the 480 years is not an exact date for when the Exodus occurred, but 12 40-year full generations. It was common in the ancient world to utilize years for symbolic messaging instead of chronology. This is because the ancient authors were not thinking about where events fit on the timeline, but were thinking of the events of the past as that which created the flow of time. Years could be used to show the completion of a process, not measure the duration of the events themselves. Additionally, calendar dates were unlikely used for chronology, but for liturgical purposes. Michael Lefebvre notes the dates of the Pentateuch do not make sense with a chronological timeline of constructing the sacred objects of the tabernacle. Instead, dates in the Pentateuch are not intended as historical data. They are liturgical markers that relate the events recounted to the festival dates observed by the listening audience. In other words, Israel organized the dates of important historical events to align with the dates their festivals fell on. Their use of historical data was not for chronological records, but served an ulterior purpose for teaching the importance of the religious festivals. This was a common way to view calendars in ancient Jewish texts. They were used to organize the dates of festivals following the courses of the moon. As Stern says, the calendar should not be perceived necessarily as a time-measuring scheme. Its primary purpose in any ancient society is to facilitate the coordination of events and activities, and to measure the duration of activities and processes. Now, when it comes to the New Testament era, we do begin to see an abstract understanding of a time dimension, separate from events and processes. This was a Greek idea that came into the New Testament, which was called chronos. This was understood to refer to an independent and infinite continuous flow of time that occurred separate from events. But the New Testament authors spoke more of time in terms of kairos, which referred more to qualitative time. It is more about the right timing in terms of events and circumstances. For example, Galatians 6:9 says, "And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due time we will all reap if we do not give up." Paul was not saying we will reap at a certain date. He was saying we will reap when all the things that must be accomplished have been. It's like stating I'll get my doctorate when the time is right. I'm not waiting for a date on the calendar, but a time in my life when the circumstances line up that I can focus on a doctorate. Despite the biblical authors being aware of and utilizing chronos, they focus more on the kairos of biblical events. They did not view Jesus' second coming as happening in terms of chronos, but in terms of kairos. When the conditions are right, and all that must be accomplished is, then Jesus will return. He is not waiting for a date, like exactly 2,000 years after the ascension, and regardless of what has been accomplished. Jesus will return when all that must be accomplished beforehand is. When we read about the day of the Lord in Scripture, we typically envision a literal calendar day, as if the Lord is scheduled to return on a Tuesday morning or something. It will come at the right time, kairos, not chronos, under the right conditions, and in the right appropriate season. The day of the Lord will occur when God is ready. In other words, the biblical authors were more focused on the events that had to be completed before Jesus' second coming. When they said the time of the second coming is near, they used the kairos sense of it, meaning most of the events that needed to happen have passed, and the next big biblical event will be the second coming. They did not necessarily mean the second coming was near in terms of chronos, meaning it was only a matter of a few years. Although they were aware of a chronos sense of time, it was secondary to kairos. Jesus' second coming could be 4,000 or 5,000 years away. It was still near in a kairos sense, because it would be the next big event God has planned. Whereas today, if we hear that time is near, we automatically assume a chronos sense. Our modern culture is dominated by a chronos sense of time, and kairos is secondary. But in the ancient world, the opposite was true. Events, processes, and activities were primary. Increments of time were secondary to this, and function within the events and processes themselves. This doesn't mean we lack the ancient sense of time. Although we're dominated by an understanding of time as a linear progression, we can still speak of time being cyclical when we say history repeats itself. Although we naturally think of time in a chronos sense, we can still structure our lives in a kairos sense and speak of it in terms of the events that we have gone through. Likewise, in the reverse, the ancient mind was aware of time in terms of increments or as a linear progression. But these ideas were secondary to their understanding of time. We look at events like the Exodus or conquest and try to find where they fit on the timeline. The ancient Israelites saw these events as what made history move forward, and would at times divide history up in terms of these events, rather than divide history up in terms of set increments and place events on a timeline. Understanding how the ancient Israelite and Jewish authors saw time can better help us understand why they wrote as they did and what they were doing with dates and numbers. Often they were not trying to give us chronology of when events occurred, but using dates and ages for symbolic purposes. Today, we care more about chronology and lining events up on a timeline, but this was not the case for the biblical authors. If we ignore the important cultural context, we can easily misunderstand what the biblical texts are trying to teach us and end up reading scripture through our modern lenses.